longtime techonomists, which I'm very proud to say. I think all three of them know each other, which is great. Look, well, I'll quickly introduce them. Jose Marie Griffiths. Did I pronounce it right? Is it Jose Marie? Is that right? Oh, you're muted. Sorry. You're muted still. I'd say.
It's not a Zoom meeting until someone does this.
Okay, thank you. That's true, Julio. I do agree with that. Anyway, I said it however I said it, and if you can't correct me, I will continue. You are still muted, though. Josh, can you help unmute Jose Marie? Ah, there you go.
The host had to unmute me, so.
Oh, sorry.
I was silenced by Josh. It's Jose Marie. It's
Jose Marie. I'm so sorry.
No problem, but you asked.
Anyway, I should have asked before this, but anyway, it's great to have you. She is the president of Dakota State University, which is in Madison, South Dakota. It's a school of 3,300 students. And you might think, what's president of a small school in South Dakota doing at a techonomy conversation? In fact, the school that Jose Marie is president of is a very unusual institution with an extremely strong focus on computer science, cybersecurity, game design. It operates at a level sufficient that it has contracts with the Jet Propulsion Lab, NSA, and other major government entities. It's one of the top programs in cybersecurity, and she is an engineer herself and a physicist who previously was CIO of University of Michigan. So she has a fascinating background for this discussion. Julio Otino is the dean of the School of Engineering at Northwestern University and another longtime techonomist, and has a lot of fascinating things to say. And I'm going to go to you first, Julio, but I want to make some opening remarks before I do that. Finally, Tony O'Driscoll, who is somebody that Josh and I have known for a really long time and has given techonomy tremendous input over many years, is at the Fuqua School at Duke in 4 different programs. And I may have to defer to him to describe all the things he does in a brief way when he starts talking, but he runs a continuing education program that focuses very heavily on helping companies solve problems with executive education. He teaches in the Graduate School of Business. He teaches in the Graduate School of Engineering. He also teaches a program which offers an MBA over 18 months for very senior corporate leaders who travel all around the world to go to 7 different countries. He designed that program. Fascinating perspective. He started his career as an engineer at IBM and ran education at IBM before he left that to go into academia. So, but before we start, in prepping for this, I ran across this really great Axios piece from last September with the headline, Higher Education's Existential Crisis. And I think this is significant since this was last September. Mm-hmm. In the true Axios fashion, it's a list, and I'm going to crib totally from it, but it's some amazing data that I think is worth setting up this conversation with. Started out talking about how, higher education is set up sort of for first-time, full-time students. That's the mindset we have of what higher education is for. In fact, 37% of American students in higher education are over 25. A quarter are parents. There's a huge gap in completion rate based on race. People of color are significantly disadvantaged, and low-income people are not getting the most out of college compared to more privileged Americans. Funding is a giant crisis. Although the incredible infrastructure of state schools the U.S. was having a major reduction in funding kind of trend even before COVID. And you can only imagine now with all the expenditure that everybody's having to make just to get through the crisis, how much difficulty state schools are going to have getting funding. Then student debt, 45 million Americans have a total of 1.6 trillion in student debt. Then there's the amazing stats about how people feel about higher education. 65% of Americans are not satisfied with American higher education. And here's an interesting partisan view. 59% of Republicans believe colleges negatively affect the country, whereas 67% of Democrats think colleges positively affect the country. Meanwhile, the employers are not getting the people they need. There aren't enough trained people. One of the reasons I think you'll hear from Jose Marie's school not being in such bad shape is that what they teach is so urgently needed, and the students are so eager to get that education because there's real money if you get trained in the stuff that Jose Marie can help them get trained in. But this question of lifelong learning that goes along with this issue of the new talents we need, we don't really know who's going to pay for that, as Axios points out. Who pays for lifelong learning? Corporations are stepping in. Tony will talk about that. But the final line they have in this great summary Axios piece is, our idea of what college is and who it should serve has changed, but the institution has not caught up. So that's my stealing of Axios for an intro. But I want to start with you, Julio. You said in our prep the first time we talked, and you've had some great, you've sent me some great stuff. You said there's BC and there's AC when it comes to higher ed. What do you mean by that?
So as I said, the meaning of AC and BC has changed forever, because there is life B, C, and AC. It will be after COVID now, okay? Now, but we talk about higher education as if it was one thing. It's, and we have been hearing pronouncements from companies and business leaders whose own institutions have vanished since the pronouncement about how higher education has to evolve. But this is such a massive place. I don't think that going forward, anything in the top 10 will change much. We're about 9 now, national rankings, and it correlates with even endowment sizes. The top 5 are kind of taken. It's Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Princeton. But there's such a huge distribution that how everybody adapts to this will depend a lot on local conditions. I was just before this call talking with the guy who will be the incoming chancellor of Vanderbilt. He's not yet there. He's living. He was the provost in Chicago. He's on to Vanderbilt, and how the plans are there. So basically, every place has the same issues. Re-entering, for example, to labs is one of the first tasks that they have. Stanford has the same problem. Harvard has the same problem. Everybody has the same problem, but the solutions will depend a lot on these boundary conditions. But I presume that there are things that will not change back. I think one thing,
for example, what? Yeah.
Well, people are discovering how much efficient is to run meetings in this format. And I guarantee that 5 years from now, we'll be running this in some virtual reality format, because this works well for, I know, I'm seeing 5 faces in here, but you don't see reactions from audiences in here, okay? So, but in many respects, many of these communication mode is highly effective, and I don't think that it will disappear. In fact, I think that what we are teaching the students now in this mode is more than the content of the course for which we are using this mode of delivery. The mode of delivery is part of a lesson that they will take for the future. How that will evolve, I have the faintest idea, but there's going to be a lot of adaptation incorporating this digital transformation. The thing that should be mentioned, I mentioned this in the conversation, I estimate that every week, with everybody going online, is multiple times the content of the Library of Congress going through the internet. And one thing that we haven't really even thought about, as opposed to hospitals handling the influx of patients, that if they were distributed through the year, it would be no problem. Germany in 2005 had 27,000 deaths by pneumonia, and they can handle it. There were no people put in trucks, refrigerated trucks, outside the hospital. The problem is now that we have every system that we have, because of efficiency, has become very fragile. Supply chains, hospitals, a whole bunch of, not so the internet. The internet is absorbing this like nothing. In fact, when you calculate how much is the Library of Congress going through the internet every week, it's barely a ripple. So I think that that was one of the big surprises. The other big surprise for us was that everybody's teaching from their home. And somehow the bandwidth that, at least from what I see from my side, is enough to handle this new world. The other surprise is how many people, I mean, if you look at the internet, you'll discover that almost every school of engineering is doing something, producing face masks or something. The people that we let doing research are people who are working in COVID-related things, okay? How much more degree of innovation has bubbled up because of this? And the degree of innovation, I see it from the point of faculty and research, and also from students. Some people are taking this as a chance to create communities, to connect possible employers with the students. This is an amazing opportunity for people who have some initiative. But for this class of 2020, God knows how many events we had with Vision 2020 in the late 90s. I think what this class will have, the biggest gift of this for this class is they will have an amazing story, okay? Right. They will tell the grandchildren how it was to graduate in the middle of this pandemic. No other class remembers who the commencement speaker was, okay? This class will have this adaptation thing, and this has to have long-term consequences.
Hey, you know, one thing before we move to the next, then I want to come back to a number of big points that I want to ask you about later, but you mentioned it, but you really have seen an explosion of innovation among your faculty and the research people at your school, right? Just quickly tell us how dramatic that's been.
Nearly every school has had something. We have had, in the category of unusual things, we have one fellow who is probably arguably the best person in bioelectronics in the world, who can put little tattoos that can measure every vital sign. And among those things, you can detect the symptoms for COVID. Now, you have to give one of these to each of them, and this records things you can access from the hospital. So that's one. There are people trying to develop antibodies, but not everything has to be with the health part. Sometimes are people working on supply chain components of these, matching donors with recipients. So we have seen innovation from people working in systems, organizations.
I think you said distribution of respirators was somebody had a project on.
Yeah. So this was, for example, a guy whose part of his work was on matching organ donations. And so expanded to this. But then there are people who probably you heard that Texas is reopening except Austin. And Austin is basing the decisions on a model that is out there. And one of the authors of the model is one of my guys. He's believing the science coming from the model, and Austin is holding. So there are lots of people in all the spectrum, some on the modeling side, some things are overkills. For example, there is one thing that made the news on respirators and face masks done by 3D printing, massive amounts. But you don't need 3D printing to create a face mask, okay? It's just an overkill. But everybody wants to do something. The problem has been, as you can imagine, liability. Our lawyers are involved. We don't want to promise things that then the university will be liable. You need a partner, approvals, but FDA is kind of fast tracking things, but you see all of these people trying to do things. And the question is, how do you keep the energy of these people kind of moving in a forward direction?
Well, especially when the resources are suddenly more constrained, and we'll get to that in a little while. Jose Marie, you were in an interesting position at Dakota State because half your students were already virtual. Talk about what your experience has been, what your concerns are, where you're optimistic, where you're pessimistic, and whether you sort of accept this BC, AC mindset, because it's a powerful model, by the way.
Thank you. Yes, we're a little bit different from the two other institutions represented. We were 50% fully online when we've been engaged in online education for about 20 years. It's more than just the delivery of the courses. We have a pretty deep infrastructure, virtual computing labs, etc., that are delivering capabilities to faculty and students remotely. Interestingly enough, the area where we had a little difficulty in switching a course quickly to online was in the highly specialized high-tech area, where we've got some state-of-the-art equipment, and we had to look at how do you deliver that functionality remotely to our students. So we actually worked with the software developers, and they worked with us. We have a fix, but it's not the best fix. So our focus, moving to online, was fairly easy for us. We have a lot of faculty very experienced in delivering online education. And we moved our staff to online very, very quickly. And we except for the people who work in the physical plant, for example, who have to be on campus to perform their work, everybody was functioning basically at 100% productivity the moment they went home. So what we found we needed to do was to really focus on the social interactions, that building and sustaining of community of various kinds for both our employees and for our students. I mean, the students have lost their co-curricular activities, the out-of-class learning activities that they're engaged in.
So you're saying using virtual means to do all
exactly. So we had to sort of be deliberate about creating those opportunities for people to connect. And the same thing for our employees too, because basically all their normal social structures and opportunities for social interaction, whether it be distributed family or civic engagement or churches or other kinds of communities, interest communities, sort of all went at one time. And so we felt it was very, very important. It's interesting, I mean, clearly AC will never be the same as BC, okay? And some people still seem to think, let's get back to normal. I'm going, what does that mean? But I do think our appreciation for human connection and social interaction is going to be, it's never going to be taken for granted again. And I think there was a tendency to take it for granted. It's always been there. We can always sort of walk across the street, go get a cup of coffee, bump into 3 people, and we can't quite do that now. What I hope, though, is we can be deliberate about the kinds of interactions that really work to our advantage and those that don't. And I do believe that education requires that kind of social fabric to it as well. It's not a question of here's course content, go take it, absorb it, now you've educated. It doesn't work that way. It's such an important part of what we do. So I think about the young students coming for whom an on-campus residential experience can be very helpful. These people are away from home for the first time. They're learning how to deal with people other than like themselves, the people they've all grown up with. They're learning about different points of view. They're learning how to express themselves, how to insinuate themselves into positions, how to lead, how to deal with a whole range of social functions. And I believe ultimately, in addition to the knowledge, content, and the specific skills they gain, one of the things we give all our students, but particularly the traditional 18 to 24-year-olds, is a certain level of confidence in being able to navigate the world, whatever the world presents to them. And I believe strongly in both the need for residential education as well as online education, which works really well for people who are already in the workforce, for whom they just can't give up their lives for 4 years, people who are transitioning. And so online education has a role too. So it's neither one nor the other. I keep being asked that, are you now going to all online? It's both.
As we're moving to online education as such a more central part of the future fabric, I mean, the after COVID world is going to be more online. I think everyone agrees with that. In fact, I love this phrase that Naomi Klein, I think, coined the other day, the Screen New Deal, which we're kind of going into. I know you have some thoughts about what you've learned over these 20 years of conducting online education at Dakota State. And you talked about synchronous and asynchronous and the need to combine those. Could you just quickly talk about that and what the best practice is in your view?
Yeah, I do believe it's a combination. I mean, asynchronous education, people that go working at their own pace, works fine. You have to have a lot of check-ins and a lot of assignments so that students stay on a certain pace. They can't get totally out of pace with everyone else. But I think coming together periodically to become part of that learning community is very important. So I do believe a combination of when should students come together, when should a class come together, when can they work separately. I'm sure my colleagues on the panel have a lot of students that are working on group projects. Those can be handled effectively through online technologies, but actually interacting in real time is very, very helpful as part of that as well. So to me, and I've been doing, I think the last class I taught was, God, a long, long time ago, but it was an online leadership and management class. We developed a lot of group activity, but I wanted to teach that course because my purpose was in, can I build and sustain community through the duration of the course, and I worked really hard to try and do that, and it worked very, very effectively, such that the face-to-face class became less popular, and the online class, the mixed class, became more popular, mainly because some of the group activities and simulations and problems we had the students work on, which you can deliver through a virtual lab kind of environment. So
one last thing I want you to make sure you comment on. I don't want to lose this before, because you actually have tenure track faculty who are online teachers purely,
yes.
right?
Yes, they're out of the state. Because we are so heavily focused in computer science, and what we call the cyber sciences, cybersecurity. It's hard to find enough faculty. We are growing, and we've been growing for the last 24 years, by the way. It's hard to find qualified faculty, and it's hard to find qualified faculty who want to come to a small city out on the prairie, and that's literally where we are, out on the prairie. And so we've had to hire people remotely, and they have, through Zoom and other platforms, become fully engaged in faculty life. They participate in committees, they participate remotely on dissertation committees, they teach their classes using a combination of technologies. They come to campus, they try and come when we do an orientation week at the beginning of every year. They come for research week. We have a research symposium. They come for that, but most of the time they are remote. And we had to push to get this through our Board of Governors, our Board of Regents. We were the first, I think the only institution to do that, but it's the wave of the future, and I think more and more institutions will be seeing that. We don't consider our remote faculty like adjuncts. They are actually full-fledged tenure-track faculty.
Thank you. I'm glad you said that. Okay, Tony, feel free to react to anything. You have such a sort of great experience of a foot in academia and a foot in business. What do you see having changed most? And I know you kind of agree with Julio that we have passed a threshold. We will never go back, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's nice to see everybody. And David, thanks for having me. I think a lot of things. The first thing is, can you hear me okay? Make sure that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
The first thing is, I think education's in my blood. So my great grandfather, my grandfather, and my father were all, I'm from Ireland originally, were all headmasters at the technical school in their local regions, and mostly focused on woodworking. So there's a question here about community college. And so I've always really been interested in motivation, in education, and it's primarily around inspiration and motivation. To me, I think Jose was talking about this a little bit, whether it's virtual or physical, I live for the eureka moment. I live for the moment where a student kind of does that, and kind of, the synapses in their head have been kind of rewired as a result of getting something, I don't know, a physical equation or something like that, or as a result of having some paradigm, some frame that they believe to be true to be shaken up. And so to me, that's when you learn, is when you see things differently than you have before, or when you get something that you didn't get before. And personally speaking, There's nothing better than that. All right. The good news for me is I think that that's fundamentally transferable and scalable online. So if that's your intrinsic motivation, I think that that's certainly something. The bad news is it probably takes more work, as Jose Marie was saying earlier, and Julio. I think, you know, those of us who do research in particular areas, we like to do that, and then we have the education piece, and we want to confer what we've learned. But I think in large institutions, research wins. I mean, research is, if you want to talk through the funding kind of model, that's where it happens. And so I think the educational institution, I think Gary Bowles is on here, talks about the Great Reset. I think all disruptions happen in kind of two forms. And Clay Christensen, before he passed, you know, a lot of his most recent books were about disrupting class, that education was the next thing to be disrupted. It's coming. And I think BC, AC, before COVID, after COVID, I think disruptions come in two forms. I see disruptions as wormholes, if you think about physics. One is they're accelerative. So I think in a way, COVID kind of accelerated us to 2030. And some of the trends that we thought were going to happen are just happening sooner. We knew retail was probably going to go away in a physical form, and that's going to get accelerated. So one form of disruption is kind of accelerative, and it kind of brings the future forward on a trajectory that we had kind of insinuated before. The second is paradigmatic, which is the wormhole takes us into the future, but perhaps on a different track. And I feel that COVID's a bit of both. I think it's both accelerative and paradigmatic, and that makes it pretty tough to figure out what the future is going to look like. And so if that's the truth, then how do we respond to that? Well, the unfortunate thing, and I think what we've seen, even if you think about a national level, is our ability to respond to something that we've not had to respond to before somewhat correlates with our experience of having had to deal with something similar in the past. So if you look at Taiwan and other countries in terms of recognizing how to respond to a pandemic because of their experience with SARS or MERS or whatever, they were kind of slightly prepared. Now, if I go and I look at all of the industries that ever existed in the history of time, and I handicap them by how much they've had to adapt and change to meet the needs of their customers, there's one that hasn't had to change at all. And that's the one called education. And so I find that we're in this really strange time where there's no question that AC, after COVID, the world is going to have to learn how to change its behavior on a scale heretofore never seen before. At the very same time where the institutions that are in place to do that, whether that's higher ed, high school, middle school, preschool, community college, have largely been built around a model of teaching people how to do things we already know how to do. When in fact, what we have to do now is collectively learn how to figure out a future we can anticipate. And so there's a fundamental epistemological problem here, which is the kind of knowledge that we have to engage in to find our way forward is very different than the way that we've built our institutions. We even separate art and science.
Right.
You know,
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, the way that we're kind of structured. And then within those, you know, those of us who do research, we're encouraged to dig deeper in the hole that we're in and be more specialized. And at the same time, what we recognize now is we need epidemiologists, we need behavioral economists, we need physicists, we need engineers to kind of work together on a shared problem and work at the intersections. And so I feel that I'm fundamentally very bullish, but I feel that we kind of need to reframe the role of education moving forward to be about generative learning and learning with and from each other to find a better future together than productive learning, which is teaching people how to do things we already know how to do. That has its place, but I feel that productive learning can be very easily ported online and delivered at scale. I think the space of generative learning is one where not just universities, it's going to have to be universities, companies, NGOs coming together to create contexts where sense making can happen to find our way to a better future.
Yeah, that's really all great stuff. I want to ask a question to you, but really to any of the three of you, sort of two kind of, I think they're related questions. Well, one thing that's happening is obviously a leveling. The more education goes virtual, the more the distinction between institutions diminishes, right? And I think all three of you mentioned that in some form when I prepped with you. And that could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. It's certainly a thing, and it also suggests a radical reduction in the cost of education to the student, quite potentially over time. But at the same time, you know, at Techonomy, as you all know, we've always been so passionately committed to a multidisciplinary thinking, you know, cross-disciplinary investigation, diverse communities coming together. And this idea of arts and sciences being historically separated, this is something I know at least two of you have very passionate opinions about. And I wonder, is there any connection? I mean, is there any hope that in a more leveled out, more virtual future of education, that we could use that moment to tackle that false dichotomy of arts and sciences?
Can I comment this?
Yeah, you go, and I'm sure Tony will have a thought, and probably Jose Marito.
So by most worldwide rankings, the US higher education is still regarded as one of the competitive advantages of the country. And I would say the best thing about the US system of higher education is that there is no system. So anybody can go and implement all the ideas that Tony mentioned. You don't have to follow a playbook. If you think that there is a competitive advantage in doing those things, you do it. And some people are evolving, but at very different speeds. For example, there is only one place that has a system in which no one has tenure, okay? Mm-hmm. But the other ones are competing in a system in which if you want to get the best economists in the world, you have to pay all of them exorbitant amount of money, and you have basically to pay them 12-month salaries as opposed to 9-month salaries. But the point is everybody can do whatever they want based on maximization of conditions, okay? So many institutions, for example, could easily navigate now and for the next 10 years because people want the degree, even though they have to pay exorbitant amounts of money to get the name associated with one institution. But these institutions are committed, for example, to Northwestern, for example, I would say more than 60 or 70%, they don't pay full price. There's at least 20% that is completely full free ride. And we see stories now of these kids who have the education paid, but the two parents are both losing their jobs. And the fact that you have full paid scholarship doesn't pay for food at home. But why do we want to do this? Because you want to immerse people in a culture like the one that they will experience while they leave the place. And if you do not know how to deal with that, then your ideas will not carry the day. The idea behind this diversity of inputs in the university is that the best way to have a good idea is to have lots of ideas, but you want all the ideas to be dissimilar. So you want the ideas to come from sets of people who are all as different as possible. But
okay.
All these universities...
Oops, what's going on? That was hugely valuable, Julio, but I still want to hear this issue about arts and sciences.
Well, the truth is, we are still operating with a model that comes from Germany in the 1800s, okay? In fact, before technology, the word technology existed, and I put in my book, you can look it up, David, who was the first president who used the word technology in a speech, for example. The word technology is pretty damn recent. It was arts and useful arts. Useful arts were everything that was engineering technology prior to those words existing. But we're still living in most places with this structure of arts and sciences on one side, social sciences, humanities, and some sciences, and technology, whereas probably the best organizational structure for the future university will be to organize them about creation, knowledge, and organization. For example, if you have these three categories, and I ask you, you have these three domains, creation, organization, and knowledge, dump every department that you have as elementary building blocks in there, and then remove the names, and you will find that you have a structure that is probably much better suited to the current reality than the one that we have now. But we have the historical legacies that are extremely hard to disband.
Well, this is what I'm trying to get at. Is this moment possibly going to help us dismantle that? Tony, quickly, and we've got tons of questions from the audience here.
Yeah.
And so I want to get to tons of stuff, but I know, Tony, you have feelings about this that are roughly as passionate as Julio's.
Yeah, I mean, I think that any institution that's been allowed to kind of perpetuate itself perpetuates itself, and so it kind of builds policy and practice to kind of reinforce the status quo. That's the nature of systems, and what used to be a capability becomes an orthodoxy and becomes a rigidity, and so in a way, every institution becomes its own enemy in becoming less and less relevant to the reality on the outside. And at the very same time, I do see a vibrant campus in the United States. I completely agree, as being probably the place where knowledge accidents, as John C. Brown says, happen. They happen accidentally on purpose because of the way that the place is kind of constructed. And so that non-academic curricular learning is probably what people are saying the real value is in. And when that gets stripped away and now everybody's sitting in the basement taking a course on Zoom, that's a great leveler in terms of just content consumption. Mm-hmm. The content consumption, I think, is kind of just very basic and pedantic. And that if all we're competing on is content kind of creation and consumption, then of course it's going to kind of normalize and flatten. The question is, I think what Jose was saying is, how do you not fall into what Drucker called the routinization trap and take massively new technology to automate the past, bad assumptions and all? Can we actually look at the affordances of technology and allow for cross-disciplinary teams to solve a particular COVID problem, whether that's from South Dakota to Northwestern to Duke together with epidemiologists, behavioral scientists, and physicists to get stuff done and bring students on the journey and allow their diversity of perspective to find a new future together.
That is one thing the virtual world will facilitate. Jose, give a thought on any of this.
I was just going to say, I mean, that was the premise for Dakota State in 1984 when we were given a mission of computing and information technology throughout the curriculum. So every student takes some element of computer science. But we've been focusing most recently on the development of cross-disciplinary programs, and our formal labs are all cross-disciplinary. There's no individual discipline lab. So we get people who are in similar spaces, physical spaces, just chatting and saying, oh, I didn't know you were doing that. Hey, why don't you do this? And all sorts of new ideas and innovations are emerging from that. We're creating new spaces to facilitate that kind of interaction.
Well, it's great. And Julio didn't mention this, but he's actually writing a book about creativity that is deeply involved with this notion of bringing together formerly separated disciplines and how we can implement that institutionally. But Josh, we have so many great questions, and I know Gary Bowles is on there. He was mentioned. I don't know if he's one you were about to pick, but I want to make sure we don't miss him. And please take the wheel here for a second.
We will definitely get to Gary. We have a lot of questions. So when I turn on your microphones to ask your question or make your comment, please identify yourself just so we know who you are. And being that we only have about 15 minutes and a lot of questions, I'm going to try to get through as many as possible. So let's start with Reza Jafari. Reza, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Thank you. Probably we can spend the entire day talking about this very, very important subject matter. I'm a trustee of the Chesapeake College in the state of Maryland, covering 5 counties, as some of you know. I was wondering if you can make 2 quick comments. One is that it sounds like learning is becoming an ecosystem platform now to create this interactive and interaction intersection of the different disciplines. And by the same token, when you come to the community colleges with limited resources, what would be their role coming for the AC after Corona, so to speak, while they're focusing on workforce management, workforce development, and working with the four-year art and science colleges and universities? Thank you.
Who wants to grab that?
Well, I can just respond very
Please.
quickly. I happen to be in South Dakota, which has no community colleges. We have a system of technical institutes and colleges, and we're working towards much more seamless transfer of credits and capabilities and issuing of credentials from K through 12 into the technical schools and to the universities. So we're working increasingly with the corporations, not-for-profits, etc., in our cities. We don't have a lot of cities; they're mostly very small. But trying to create a more of a focus in the roles that we each have. So I still see the universities created a community college in Sioux Falls because we didn't have one. We didn't have a university there, and there was a gap. So we have a collaborative effort among 3 universities to create a community college. So we're just saying we're all in the business of education. And the other thing I always like to say, especially to economic developers who say we're economic developers, I'm saying we're economic developers too, that we're also thinking about talent development, workforce development, and economic benefit to our local areas, to our states and so on, whether that be through education or through research capabilities.
Shall we go to another one, Josh, real fast?
I had a quick thing on that, if I may.
Okay, go.
So I really appreciate the notion of ecosystem, and I think ecosystem's a overused term. It's probably in business, but I think it's about the framing. I really feel it's important for us to frame the question of, what role will education play in society in an AC world? And if we ask ourselves that question, and we recognize that we're all going to have to learn more and differently than we ever have before to kind of sustain society, a couple of things have to shift. I think we have to think of technological affordance to kind of create new learning platforms rather than technical automation to increase the efficiency with which we train poorly. I think we have to think about context curation at least as much as we think about content creation. I think we have to think about focusing on problems and needs over focusing on learning objectives. I think we need to recognize that the world we're leading into is more generative, and we have to figure things out a lot more than find things out. I think we need to think about learning to innovate rather than teaching to imitate. I do think productive learning has its place, and we all need to know the laws of physics, but they're learnable online quite readily and at scale. It's the generative, co-creative learning that's going to find a new future based on diversity of perspective and thought. That's what we need right now. I think we need problem-solving networks rather than subject matter experts. I think we need generative collaboration more than productive coercion. Come to my class. We're happy when we have lines of people waiting outside a classroom. We're happy when we don't admit people into school. This isn't the kind of model we need in a world where we have to basically do a full upgrade of society in terms of what we understand. We still have summer holidays because that's when we used to have to go tend to the fields. I mean, a lot of the orthodoxies of how we work in school are kind of, they're rooted in the 1700s, I think, as Julio was saying. I think we need to learn while doing rather than learning before doing. That we can't. It's kind of like how we're developing vaccines today. We don't have time to kind of try and stepwise this thing and research it as we go. We kind of need to do things in real time, which means that we need to learn informally with and through each other, and therefore we need to think about learning's value to society over training volume. It's not about the number of courses we teach and the number of heads we count. It's how we can bring people together in a community on an ecosystem platform, be that a university, be that a community college, be that an NGO, be that Google, MIT, as Scott talks about. There'll be a million models, and there's no better place in the United States for those models to emerge, and more power to it. Let 1,000 flowers bloom.
When I write my summary of this panel, which will come out next week, I'm definitely going to take some of what you just said. Shall we go to the next one, Josh?
We have Gary already teed up. So Gary, you want to ask your question?
All right, thanks, Josh. So I think as David knows, when I wrote the piece on unbundling higher education 6 years ago on Medium, I said, what business do you know of that for 4 years treats you as a customer and for the rest of your life treats you as a cash register? Mm-hmm. And so the model's got to change, right? You've got people have been paying a relatively premium product in many cases on site, although of course with Jose Marie, half our students are also remote. But basically, what we found with the media business is, as David and Josh know quite well, is we had to adjust from an analog dollar for an ad to a digital dime. We had to get by on a business that actually, was going to get far less revenue. So how do you folks think about the business side of these institutions? I mean, how many colleges will there be in 10 years, BC? What do you think of how the adjustment will need to go in terms of just the business model, and what do you think are some of the signposts for what could actually help to maintain a lot of in-place colleges?
So if by customer one means the group of people or sets of organizations that if one does well with them, your business improves. Yeah, students are customers for many universities, so is the federal government, parents, and a whole bunch of things. But academia is probably the only business I know, well, maybe health club is another one, where the customer is also your product. You are as good as the product that you have put out there, and it's an interesting kind of product. If BMW makes really bad cars 2 years in a row, they are in trouble. University has much longer shelf life. Princeton is Princeton because everybody who has a degree of Princeton and is yet not dead adds value to Princeton. Okay, you collect the Eric Schmidts and the Jeff Bezos and everybody who is there with the, so and this varies so much between institutions. We always talk about higher education as if it was one thing. It's so segmented and multimodal. One can sort of maybe understand France by understanding Paris. One cannot understand the US by understanding New York. And higher education is more like the US than France. It's multimodal with lots of agents trying to maximize the boundary conditions that they have. And as I said, if someone has a good idea, like the many ideas that Tony was mentioning, they will adapt it. But the truth is, I don't see any time soon that places that have $34 billion in the endowment will go under anytime soon. And that includes Harvard, Yale, Princeton. But then the list is so long that there are opportunities for innovation at all points in the chain. But the most important thing is to recognize the students are also a product. They are not only customers. They are the product, and the product is what gives value to the institution.
Interesting, really interesting.
David, could I jump in on that one real quick?
Please. Yeah.
Because I think, as somebody who studies innovation, if you look at Keeley and Doblin's research, the two kinds of innovation that have delivered the most value over the last 15 years are not really about product or service. They are about business model, and network, who you partner with. This is why the whole ecosystem stuff is so big. Is why do you have to become good at something yourself when you can go partner with somebody and quickly bring something to market? So you kind of have these arrangements where you're bringing capability together to deliver value that you can deliver quicker. And so if you think about that, I think part of this has to do with the business model. And I wonder if David Bowie couldn't teach us something here. So David Bowie, before he passed, had this crazy idea where you could buy stock in David, not in his albums. So we weren't waiting for his last album and then what he'd make in terms of revenues on the back end of his last album. You could invest in David, and whatever he earned post investing in David, it's almost like David is a corporation. So we always hear if you go to Duke, or you go to Northwestern, or you go to whatever, these big schools, you're waiting for that endowment to get loaded up when the alums graduate, et cetera, et cetera. What if the model was more, we believe in our education so much that we want you to come for free, And then there's a model through whatever. This is just a technology problem, blockchain.
I think Yale
like
did
that.
some version of that at one point, and maybe
Yeah.
they still do, Tony.
So then you're kind of trying to attract people to the ecosystem that you're building because these people are curious, and then you share in the benefit that they create moving out. I don't know, but what I do know is, to Gary's question, I totally agree. You know, we have students as captives for 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, and then we're just running around chasing them for dollars afterwards. It's like the ET guy on the bike running around saying, "Where's my money? Where's my money?" I don't know that that's a good model. I don't know that we will fully leverage the power that technology can bring to generative learning unless we shift the model. The model is, you know, we've learned this from all these other, the reason Google is good is not necessarily their technology was good, but their model, the auction was good. So I think we have to find a profit motive type model, but in a shared value context, like what Porter talks about, to make this all work. And it'll probably be not just traditional educational institutions, but you would see companies and others play, because companies need education at scale. You know, when I was at IBM, we had to train 400,000 people a year. We couldn't do that through a university model. So
I want to ask a somewhat crass comparatively question of Jose Marie. When I mentioned at the outset about state schools being really pressed for funding, I noticed you nodded as you're nodding already on this one. And you are in a community of presidents of universities and colleges around the country. You know how the sentiment is. How worried are the leaders of state schools in general that their whole funding model is in jeopardy?
I think people are very, very worried about that. I mean, even before COVID, there were concerns. There were concerns within the states that the amount of state funding going to state-funded institutions was going down. I mean, when I was at Michigan, and that was in the late 90s and early 2000s, we used to joke that Michigan was a state-located institution, not a state-supported institution. And we saw the state funding go from, I don't know, 20-something% down to single digits in terms of overall budget. So I do believe it's a concern, particularly with the sort of national publicity over the cost of higher education. I do think that as we look at the tiers of education, so take the privates out, although some privates are still very vulnerable, not the big name privates, but a lot of others are very, very sensitive to enrollment numbers, and 50 students one way or the other can make or break them. So I think if you look at the institutions almost by size, there's a whole layer of higher education institutions that are actually likely to be wiped out. They would have been over a longer period of time, but I think COVID is now going to, as Tony said, accelerate that process, and we'll see them disappear. So
what kind of time frame?
I think over the next 3 years.
Wow.
Yeah, I think we'll see a whole lot. We've seen them, you know, closing, you've read about them, etc. You know, onesies and twosies, and now I think we're going to see double-digit numbers just fall off the map.
Jose, could I ask you a quick question? And do you see perhaps though, like at North Carolina State University system, right? So NC State and UNC.
She used to teach there, by the way.
I was at Chapel Hill, yeah.
Yeah, and so those two, in any state, you know, the primary technical and the primary liberal arts school are fine. But if you go down into a Fayetteville State University or some of the smaller ones, do you perhaps see a role where they shift from the four-year college degree to kind of technical school 2.0? I mean, because I think just like you need plumbers, you're going to need data plumbers. Like there's a whole new industry of kind of technical trades, and that those institutions might move in that direction? Or?
Yes, I think we see a strengthening of the technical trade schools that we already have. And then as we see how the world emerges and the kinds of needs we see coming, particularly because of the growth of the needs for AI and, you know, I mean, in fact, let me go back to 2008 for a minute with the downturn in the economy. The new jobs created since the downturn of the economy, I think 80% of the new jobs created have required a bachelor's level education. And I think that's going to continue. But we have these supporting infrastructures before that. And so what I think institutions are doing, or should do, we're certainly doing it, is working to create these sort of opportunities for multiple pathways into the higher education system, the opportunity for people to earn stackable credentials. They don't all have to go through education at the same pace. They can come into the higher education environment, pick up some credentials, digital badges, certificates, whatever, go back out into the workplace for a while, engage in apprenticeships. The apprenticeship model is, I think, going to strengthen, particularly in those tech areas, and then come back and, maybe while they're apprentice, they take some more courses, and they just gradually stack their credentials over time. But so I wanted, if I could just jump in with 2 comments. When we were talking about the ecosystem, it seemed to me that ultimately what COVID might leave us with as a society is engendering a culture of learning. It's not just the specific pieces of learning, but if we have a culture where learning is really respected and valued, then all the various institutions of higher education and the people that benefit from the graduates of those programs would benefit generally. So it seems.
Why would COVID do that?
Pardon?
Why will COVID do that?
Just because it's shaking us up. We have to rethink everything. Everything, even K through 12 education. I mean, parents who've had 3 children at home for the last 9-10 weeks are realizing what happens when they send their kids into a classroom and they're having to help them through it. So I just think it's all up in the air because so much of society has been stopped. And we've all got to come to a halt and say, what does this mean? I've been surprised.
And I think that for some segment of the population, not all of it, for some, there is a no respect for science.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a good point in relation to this conversation, actually.